A man slipped into the hall through the back door in dirty work overalls. People who saw him laughed, and someone joked, "Let's see if the tractor guy can play." And he, a lonely dad, just there to pick up his daughter. But he walked up to the stage, and when he played the first note, the whole room forgot to breathe. Because this wasn't a talent show. This was the first sentence of a life that had been silenced. David Kramer wasn't someone anyone would notice. His clothes never stood out, and his voice never filled a room. He was just a tired, quiet dad. Dark circles under his eyes, calloused hands, quick steps, but he was invisible. He always entered his daughter's school through the back door because standing at the front made him feel exposed, a feeling he hadn't had in a long time. But tonight, everything was about to change. All because of one little moment that started as a joke. The school gym had the same boring atmosphere as any other meeting. Folding chairs squeaked, parents played with their phones, some whispered quietly. That night's parent meeting was planned as a bonding night between the school and the families. There were slideshows, volunteer sign-up sheets, and finally, a little surprise, the talent share segment. The assistant principal was making an announcement, but barely anyone was listening, until a voice called out from the back corner. "Hey, let's get the handyman up here. Let's see the workshop pianist in action." It was supposed to be a joke, but the tone was sharp. A few heads turned among the laughter. All eyes landed on a man in a hoodie and black jeans, his shoulders a little hunched, late to his daughter's seat. David. All he wanted was to quietly slip in and sit next to his daughter. But that mocking comment cut right through him. The little girl next to him, Leah, looked up and whispered, "Dad, you can play, right?" David's eyes met his daughter's. In them, there was the tiniest bit of hope. Fragile but real. For a moment, time froze. The voices faded. The laughter died down. And then, David stood up. The room suddenly went quiet. No one really expected him to go up on stage. David started walking toward the piano. The sound of his shoes echoed across the floor. His steps once used to be followed by applause, but now they were just careful, measured, and silent. When he reached the piano, he paused before touching the keys. He looked them over with his eyes. This wasn't unfamiliar ground. Once, it had been his home. But now, it was just an echo of the past. Sitting at the front was one of the teachers, a young, graceful woman with sharp eyes, Nora Becker, the assistant principal. She didn't know David, but something about him felt familiar. Their eyes met for a brief moment. There was no smile, no expectation, just silence. And then, David sat down. When he touched the keys for the first time, the room seemed to breathe again. The first notes were uncertain, shaky, like he was searching for something. But the sequence that followed, it was something else. He wasn't playing a memorized piece. David was improvising, right there, for the first time in years. Every sound that came from the keys was like the echo of a memory, stretching from the past into the present. It was like he was trying to say something. A story he couldn't put into words, something he'd kept inside for years. And now, only his fingers could tell it. Leah got up from her chair and slowly walked onto the stage. Her small steps blended with the rhythm of the melody. When she reached the stage, she sat down next to her dad and gently leaned her head on his shoulder. David kept playing, because at that moment, this music wasn't just a part of the past anymore, it was now a piece of his daughter's future too. When the piece ended, the room was silent. No one believed that what happened was just a talent show anymore. It was something else. Deep, real, and quietly explosive. Then, a little kid started clapping. Then a mom. And soon the whole room was filled with applause. Some parents wiped their eyes, some just bowed their heads. David stood up, took his daughter's hand, and quietly stepped off the stage. He didn't bow, didn't say thank you. Because that night, it was the notes that deserved thanks. And they had done their job. But Nora's eyes never left him. Because in that moment, she knew. This man was not just anybody. And she could feel that this story was only just beginning. The atmosphere at school was different the next morning. After parent meetings, kids usually talked about boring homework, moms about cake recipes, and dads about fighting over parking spots. But this time, there was only one thing people talked about. That man. That humble-looking dad in his work clothes, and the story he told on the piano. Even in the teacher's lounge, questions circled the coffee cups. Did he really play? What was that piece? How can someone that quiet hide such a talent? In the classrooms, the kids crowded around Leah, their eyes wide, all asking the same question. Is your dad really a pianist? Leah had seen this side of her dad for the first time on stage. And honestly, she felt both proud and surprised. In her eyes, her dad had always been a hero, but now that others saw him that way too, her little heart was filled with both hope and fear. Because when a secret comes out, sometimes the world gets brighter and sometimes it gets a little harsher. In the afternoon, the assistant principal, Nora Becker, was sitting at her desk. She had replayed that night in her mind over and over. She knew how to play piano. She had even thought about going to music school once. But it wasn't the technique that mattered. It was the feeling behind those notes that night. David's fingers hadn't just touched the keys, they'd touched the heart of everyone who watched. And she recognized his version from somewhere. It felt like an echo of a performance she'd seen years ago and never forgotten. Nora opened her computer. She tried different keywords: jazz Clair de Lune, male pianist school gym, improvisation version. The results weren't satisfying. Later, she pulled out an old notebook. She'd scribbled notes in it as a kid. On one of the pages, in shaky handwriting, there was this line: 1998, youth piano competition, no name, but I still remember the sound. She shivered inside. Could it really be him? That bright young kid on stage back then? Was it the same man now, with lines on his cheeks and calluses on his hands, still giving off the same feeling? Something inside her said, it's time to ask. Just then, David appeared in the small school hallway. He'd come early to pick up Leah. He had a plastic bag in his hand, and he was hanging her coat in her locker. Nora walked over without hesitation. Mr. Kramer, she said kindly. David turned and looked at her. There was a tired but alert look in his eyes. Yes. Nora paused for a second. I'd like to talk to you, if you have a minute. David didn't answer at first. He didn't look away, but you could almost see the walls go up. Then he nodded slightly. They went into the school's music room. It was old but soundproofed. There was a second piano pushed up against the wall. As David entered, he glanced at the piano for a moment. Nora noticed. That piece you played last night. Nora said softly. It was Clair de Lune, but your version was unique. I've only heard it once before. On a TV program, years ago. Do you remember that competition? David's shoulders dropped a little. There was a glimmer in his eyes, but his lips were silent. Finally, he looked down. Yes, he said, but that kid is long gone. Nora nodded gently. No, last night, that kid played again, just with a man's hands now. Those words cracked David's defenses a little, but he wasn't fully open. Then Leah came in. She peeked through the door, holding her backpack, and asked, Are we ready? David glanced at her, then turned back to Nora and said, I'll tell you the whole story one day, but not yet. Nora smiled. I can wait. I know music can't be rushed. That night, David was washing dishes in the dim kitchen light, his mind stuck on Nora's words. He thought about that kid, that unfinished competition, that night. Then he looked down at his hands. These hands carried boxes, turned wrenches, paid bills now. But that night, they were just telling a story. Without realizing it, he walked into the living room. He lifted the cover of the old piano, touched the keys, played a single note, then another, then a phrase. The melodies echoing in his head started to come back, not in his memory, but in his hands, in his heart, in his daughter's eyes. And maybe now, staying silent wasn't protecting the past, maybe it was forgetting it. And that night, he wrote the first note on a blank page in his notebook. David couldn't sleep at all that night. He stared at the CD for a long time, but he didn't have the courage to play it. It was as if he actually heard the real sound of the past, today's silence would lose all its meaning. For so many years, he had buried this story underground, piling stones of responsibility on top of it. But now, in his daughter's gaze, in Nora's words, and in the awakening at his fingertips, this story was quietly rising up from the ground, knocking on his door. In the very first light of morning, he turned on the old CD player in the living room. After a faint static, the first notes of a young piano came through. That old interpretation, Clair de Lune, but different. His own sound. What hit him like a punch to the heart was this. He hadn't forgotten. Every phrase, every transition, every rubato was still in his mind, just buried. And now that grave had been opened. Before Leo woke up, he made breakfast. He put 2 glasses of milk on the table and left a little note. There's something I need to talk to you about today. When Leah came in, her eyes were still sleepy, but when she read the note, she smiled. Really? She asked. David nodded. Time for a dad's secret. And then, for the first time in his life, he told his little girl about the days he played on stage, the competition, how his mom practiced with him all night, his father's stroke, and how everything suddenly changed after that. Leah stayed quiet. She didn't look away, but at one point, she gently took her father's hand. "You stayed silent," she whispered, "because you had no other choice." David's throat tightened. "But now I can talk," Leah added. "Not instead of you with you." That day at school, Assistant Principal Nora was looking over a poster draft. It said, "With the power of music, Solidarity Night for the school fund." It was going to be a concert night. The old school piano would get a little fixing up, and a mini concert would be held with student and parent participation. But the whole school was whispering about something else. Would that dad play again? With this on her mind, Nora wrote David an email. The sentence was simple and kind. "David, would you let the music speak again? This time, knowing you're not alone." David didn't open the email for hours. Then, suddenly, he called. "I'll play," he said. "But this time, there'll be someone with me on stage." Nora was surprised. "Who?" David paused, then said with pride, "My daughter." As concert night approached, the whole school was filled with a wave of excitement. Colorful notes decorated the hallways, student drawings were on the class boards, and there were little messages dedicated to the piano. Music is a memory. Silence is sometimes the most beautiful melody. A father story. David and Leah practiced together every evening. They chose a simple piece, but added a story to it. To Lee's basic melody, David accompanied with his left hand. They put little pauses between the notes. Those pauses meant more than anything, because in those spaces were the years David had been silent. Lee's birth, her first step, the first time she said dad. Every note was a memory. Every rhythm was a step towards starting again. Nora came to watch them practice a few times. Quietly, from the back, her eyes would get misty as she watched, because it wasn't just music there. It was the rebirth of a man from his own ashes. And the fact that this man now knew he wasn't alone was something as powerful as music itself. And finally, concert night arrived. This time the old gym was lit up with fairy lights. The stage held that aged but restored piano, standing proud. The audience waited in anticipation. The first few performances were student pieces. The students got applause, the teachers gave thanks. But everyone kept glancing at the same spot. Who's next? Nora stepped up to the microphone. "The next piece isn't just music," she said. "It's a bond. The shared melody of past and future, of father and daughter. Please welcome David and Leah Kramer to the stage." Whispers rose from the crowd. David took his daughter's hand. They walked on stage together. David didn't bow. He just turned to Leah and whispered, "Ready?" "Always, with you," Leah said. They sat at the piano. David started with a heavy but steady rhythm in his left hand. Leah played the melody with her right. She hit wrong notes sometimes, hesitated sometimes. But David was always there. In the music, with her. He gently covered every wrong note, wrote a new sentence for every hesitation. The audience forgot to breathe. Because this wasn't just a concert, it was healing. After the final note, the hall stayed silent. Then, the standing ovation started. But David didn't stand up. He put his hand on his daughter's back. "This is your stage now," he said. And there was an understanding in the room, mixed with tears. Some melodies touch not just the ears, but the heart. And some stories aren't just written in notes, but in glances, in hugs, in silences. After the concert, the school hall had started to slowly empty out, but David still hadn't left the stage. He was sitting quietly on the small wooden stool next to the piano, holding Lee's bag in his hand. There was still a flicker of excitement in his daughter's eyes. The stage had become their shared space now. The truths that silence had tried to hide for years had finally spoken that night through the music. Nora was standing backstage alone. She adjusted her scarf with her hands, then started walking toward David. As the last echoes of the crowd faded out the back door, only the soft ring of a piano key remained in the hall. David gently closed the piano lid and turned to Nora. There was a tired but bright light in his eyes. "You've got a whole concert hall inside you, David," Nora said with a slight smile. David shrugged. "But nobody was buying tickets," he answered with a sigh mixed with irony. Nora grew serious. "Sometimes we even refuse to buy a ticket to our own story. Like the music inside us belongs to someone else." David lowered his head. "I gave up everything. Music school, the stage, the first piece I ever composed. None of it made me feel as strong as Leah does. Maybe back then I didn't love music, just the stage. Now I can play without a stage, as long as there's someone listening." Nora was silent. Then she took a piece of paper from her pocket. The folds were worn, but there were a few lines written by hand. "My mom wrote this letter after watching that competition in 1998. This boy, one day, will bring someone back to life with his music," she wrote. "Back then it felt like a romantic dream. But tonight I understood what she meant." David looked at the letter. He held the paper with trembling hands. His eyes were fixed on that sentence. Bring back to life. Until that day, he'd only seen himself as someone who had given up. But now, with Nora's voice, his daughter's melody, and the applause in the hall, he felt like he'd been reborn. The next day, when David went to work, everything was the same, but nothing was the same. Concrete walls, hammer sounds, forklift engines. It all felt like a different kind of background music now, because a new melody was playing in his mind. There was hope in the chords and answers in the silence of the past. When he got home that evening, a surprise was waiting for him. Leah had arranged her sheet music on the little table. Next to it was a letter. In big, bold letters, it said, "Will you help me with my new piece, Dad?" David picked up the paper. Underneath, there was a 3-line melody. Simple, childlike, but meaningful, because it was a beginning. Leah was no longer just a listener, but a storyteller. Another voice to carry on his story. They sat down at the piano together. David added a few chords with his left hand to the melody. Then quietly, he pulled out his notebook. That notebook, the one that had been sitting on a dusty shelf for years, full of unfinished pieces. Now he opened to a blank page and wrote a title at the top. Together, Breathless. Late that night, the doorbell rang again. This time, nobody was expecting anyone. When David opened the door, he found Nora standing there with a coffee thermos in her hand. "I was just out for a walk," she said. "But I guess my feet brought me here." David smiled. "Maybe the music led you again." They came inside. Leah went to the kitchen and made 3 mugs. In the living room, the notebook was open and the piano lid was up. Nora walked over to the piano, gently closed the lid, then turned to David. "Years ago, after that competition, my mom told me, real musicians echo in people's hearts even after they step off the stage." She looked right at him. "You never left the stage, David. After all these years, you just stepped back onto it. And this time, you're not alone." In Nora's eyes, David found a kind of trust he hadn't felt in years. Then he quietly lowered his head. Sometimes it takes a lifetime to finish a piece, but some pieces only really get finished when they're written together. Without taking her eyes off her father, Leah turned back to the sheet music. She put her finger on the first note and murmured, "Are we ready?" David and Nora answered at the same time, more than ever. And in that house, a new melody began to rise from the old piano. It didn't just belong to the past or to the future. It belonged to that moment. And in that melody, 3 hearts beat together. After the concert night, the whole atmosphere of the town changed. It was like there was an invisible tune floating in the air. People didn't just know David as Lee's dad anymore. Now he was the man at the piano. In the town's old music shop, people started talking about the night he played. Shopkeepers were putting extra money into the school's donation box, and even the local bakery had come up with a special recipe after the concert, calling it Melody Bread. But that wasn't the only thing that changed for David. In the mornings, before leaving for work, he would sit at the piano and write new notes in his notebook. There were still shadows from the past in his mind, but now he had the courage to walk through them. With every note, he forgave the silent years a little more, healed a little more. One morning, when Nora came to school, she found an envelope on her desk. It was from David. Inside, there was a short but clear note. "Is the music teacher position still open? If so, I'd like to come in for an interview. Sincerely, David Kramer." Nora's hands trembled as she read those lines. This wasn't just a job application. It was a man being reborn from his ashes. In that moment, the first thing that came to her mind was the letter her mother had written years ago. This boy will one day bring someone back to life with his music. Yes, that boy had brought himself back to life first. The interview took place in the school's music classroom. Nora asked the formal questions, but with every answer, a new layer showed itself. David was no longer just a talented musician, but someone who had been patient, who had lost, who had waited, and who had chosen to start over. Nora looked him in the eye and smiled. We want you here not just for your music, but for your story too. By the end of that year, David Kramer was the school's full-time music teacher. In his classes, he didn't just teach notes, he showed silent students how to speak up and shy kids how to express themselves through melodies. He didn't usually talk about his own story, but whenever a child was afraid to get on stage, he'd put a hand on their shoulder and whisper. Sometimes the best pieces come from the deepest silence. For Leah, life had completely changed. Her classmates didn't just call her the girl who plays piano anymore. Now, kids were lining up to work with her. Her teacher, following David's lead, suggested a special scholarship for Leah, a music camp for creative kids out of town. At first, she hesitated. She didn't want to leave her dad. But David looked at her, smiled, and said, "When I was your age, I couldn't set out on a journey. But now you can. And I'll be right here. Always." When summer came, Nora and David took Leah to the bus station. She had a small suitcase, a backpack with her notebook, and a t-shirt covered with music notes. As the bus drove away, Nora and David stood silently side by side. "You know," Nora said, "your daughter didn't just change your life. She changed mine, too." David nodded. "She made me who I am," he said. "She taught me not just who I was, but who I could be." Months passed. The school's autumn concert was being planned. This time, it wasn't just David at the piano, his students were with him. Nora watched from the back row. David looked over his students one last time, then bowed his head slightly and began to play. It felt more like the next chapter of a story than a concert. When the final note sounded, the hall was silent. Before the applause started, Nora stood up, her eyes full of tears. As the applause rose, David's eyes caught something at the entrance. Leah, back with her suitcase, standing at the door. Her eyes were shining, and she held her notebook up high, shouting, "I wrote, too." David smiled. Only one word escaped his lips. "Let's keep going." And at that moment, they truly understood, some stories never close. Some songs never end. They just wait quietly for the right time. And finally, the right time had come.